all just get on with our lives. He said that last night. Today, President Obama said, no, let's not. I'm Jim Sciutto, sitting in again tonight for Anderson, and that's the story at the heart of a very busy evening. The White House unleashing sanctions on Russia, as well as high-ranking Kremlin figures bouncing Russian diplomats and shutting a pair of Russian compounds here in the U.S. And now, late tonight, the president-elect, who has been so reluctant about blaming anyone for the hacking, he's speaking out again. First CNN's Evan Perez joins us for the latest on what the president-elect is doing and the current president is doing in response to this. Evan, so what did President Obama have to say about why he took these actions now?
Well, Jim, this extraordinary set of sanctions, President Obama says, was in response to not only the meddling in the U.S. election, but also to months of harassment of U.S. diplomats in Russia. The president said in a statement, I'll read part of it, it says, these actions follow repeated private and public warnings that we have issued to the Russian government and are a necessary and appropriate response to efforts to harm U.S. interests in violation of established international norms of behavior. He also added that the U.S. will take additional actions that will not be publicized. Jim, is a reference to possible covert retaliations that we may never know about.
It's been more than 2 months, 2.5 months, since the intelligence community fingered Russia for being behind these attacks. Right. Why now? Why is President Obama taking action just now?
Well, exactly. And as you know, this is something that's been debated among folks in the administration for months. And since Donald Trump's election, even Democrats were being sharply critical of the president for not doing more publicly. It's also clear that the administration sees the clock ticking, 3 weeks to the new administration. The president-elect has not only been openly skeptical of the intelligence information that the Russians indeed were doing this, he has said he wants to turn the page to better relations with Moscow. It's highly unlikely that he would take any of these actions once he takes office.
So the question is, what does he do with these sanctions in place? Could President-elect Trump easily turn them around, reverse them?
Well, absolutely. These are presidential orders. So, yes, President Trump can, with the stroke of a pen, simply roll all of this back. Administration officials today told reporters that doing that would be highly unusual. But there's also the fact that members of Congress, including Republican leaders, today endorsed President Obama's actions. You know, they also criticized President Obama for not doing some of it sooner. And some promise that Congress will take its own actions, perhaps making some of these sanctions tougher to roll back, Jim.
Well, it's a remarkable back and forth between the outgoing and incoming president. Evan Perez, thanks very much. Now, more on the president-elect, who has just weighed in tonight with the very briefest of statements. It reads, and I'll read it in full, quote, "It's time for our country to move on to bigger and better things. Nevertheless, in the interest of our country and its great people, I will meet with leaders of the intelligence community next week in order to be updated on the facts of this situation," end quote. That's all. CNN's Suzanne Malveaux joins us now. Suzanne, you were on the call with Sean Spicer, the incoming White House press secretary, earlier today. President-elect Trump's pick for the White House when he takes office. What did he have to say about the sanctions?
Well, Jim, Spicer said there are two aspects of this. One is political, that Trump and his transition team believe that there are people on the left who are trying to undermine or discredit Trump's big win, and that is what is largely driving this. Trump has called the accusation that Russia is behind this as ridiculous, just another excuse for delegitimizing his victory. And Spicer also says if the U.S. has clear evidence that Russia interfered with the election, it should be put out publicly for all to see. He says they need further facts or evidence that this is actually true. Now, as you know, Trump gets his daily intelligence briefings, in this case 3 times a week. So certainly the intelligence community would argue they have presented them with all the information that he needs. Earlier in the week, we saw Trump injecting more skepticism, saying that computers have complicated lives very greatly. He says the whole age of computers has made it where nobody knows exactly what's going on, that we have speed, we have a lot of other things, but he says, I'm not sure we have the kind of security we need. So the emphasis here, Jim, is on cybersecurity, not retaliation against Russia. And so far, Trump and his team have not indicated whether or not he would take that extraordinary step of reversing the sanctions.
Well, I mean, it's also, frankly, on muddying the waters here, because the fact is the U.S. intelligence community has identified North Korea as being behind the Sony attack, China being behind previous cyber hacks. So it really seems that there's a widespread and really increasingly isolated effort by the Trump camp, because many Republicans have come out and said, in fact, really, the vast majority of Republicans have come out and said Russia is behind this. What is the Trump camp saying to defend that line?
Well, one of his top advisors, Kellyanne Conway, telling CNN this evening that what they're seeing in President Obama's final days in office is this kind of toughness on his way out the door that people hadn't seen before with the sanctions against Israel and now Russia. So read between the lines there. She said some of these moves that the White House is making is largely symbolic. And again, that partisans are trying to fight the election war 52 days later. Here's how she put it.
All we heard all through the election was Russia, Russia, Russia. Whenever it came to anything Donald Trump said or did, it seemed most days. And now, since the election, it's just this fever pitch of accusations and insinuations. Even those who are sympathetic to President Obama on most issues are saying that part of the reason he did this today was to, quote, box in President-elect Trump. That would be very unfortunate if that were if politics were the motivating factor here. But we can't help but think that that's often true.
And Jim, previously, Trump has said that he does not believe sanctions against Russia when the annexed Crimea actually worked. He called it useless, that is something that he might consider actually reversing. He has not made a comment either way whether or not he would reverse these sanctions. Jim?
Yeah, shocked that politics could possibly be involved in Washington. Suzanne Malveaux, thanks very much. During the Cold War, both sides lived by Newton's third law. Every action would produce an equal and opposite reaction. Expel a diplomat, expect one of yours to be sent packing as well. You could pretty much set your watch by it. So what about today? What are we hearing from Moscow in terms of its own response, retaliation to retaliation? CNN's Matthew Chance is there in Moscow for us tonight and joins us with the latest. So Matthew, what is the Kremlin saying they are planning to do, and have they taken any steps yet?
Well, in terms of what they're planning to do, the Kremlin have been pretty tight-lipped. They've said, look, obviously, reciprocal actions, as you just mentioned, are the only thing that count in a situation like this. So they're giving the sense that there are going to be US diplomats that are going to potentially face expulsion as well. But they haven't officially announced that. I've heard from the Foreign Ministry earlier on this evening that any kind of first announcements are going to start coming through tomorrow morning here, local time. It's in the middle of the night at the moment, so they're not saying anything. The final decision will be with Vladimir Putin. That's been made clear as well. And he's not in any rush, according to the Kremlin, to make that decision. Now, whether that means he's going to hold back and possibly for a few weeks until Donald Trump takes over the White House, or whether he's going to act sooner than that, remains to be seen in terms of the expulsions. What we are hearing from a source in Washington, though, is that there have already been some measures announced, or at least the American side has been informed of some measures. One of them is the closure to US or foreign citizens, US and Canadian and British citizens, of the Anglo-American school, which is the main expatriate school here in Moscow. I've got lots of friends who send their kids there. It'd be a kind of a sideswipe. I've spoken to the principal tonight. He says he can't confirm it at the moment. He's waiting for further details about what exactly the situation is. But if it turns out to be the case, then that would be a real sideswipe to the diplomatic community here, particularly from the United States, many of whom who are family people send their children to a school like that. And so that could be something that will be clarified in the morning.
Enormously disruptive for families. I remember when the Magnitsky Act was passed here, Anti-Corruption Act, Russia suspended adoptions by Americans. So a tactic that's been used before. Matthew Chance in Moscow, thanks very much. Perspective now from CNN national security analyst Juliet Kayyem. She's former assistant secretary at the Department of Homeland Security. Also Stephen Hall, he's a 30-year veteran of Russian operations at the CIA, author of a recent piece for the Washington Post titled Why the CIA Won't Go Public with Evidence of Russia's Hacking. And we also have CNN's former Moscow bureau chief, Jill Doherty. She's now a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center here in Washington. Stephen, if I could start with you, your reaction to the actions announced today. When we spoke last, you were concerned that naming names, even making intelligence findings, could be costly for those in the CIA and the FBI. And the battle here for U.S. intelligence is that this is secret stuff, right? And it reveals sources and methods. It reveals access that you have inside Russian systems. So there's only so much, isn't there, that you can lift the veil?
Yes, this seems to be the first step that the administration is taking now to respond to the Russian hacks. It seems to be starting to sort of break down into three different categories: the sanctions against the FSB, which is one of the civilian intelligence services, and then the GRU, one of the military intelligence services. Seems to be largely, I would say, more symbolic. You've also got the expulsion, the persona non grata status of the 35 diplomats that will be removed here from Washington. I would be shocked if something like that didn't happen to our diplomats in Moscow. So I think what you're seeing is the first stage of this now.
And that has cost, does it not? Because, I mean, we're talking about Russian diplomats leaving here, but really the understanding is that they're intelligence operatives. And in any country like this, it is understood that there are spies on the ground, some declared, some not declared. And, of course, the U.S. has spies on the ground, if we want to call them that, in Russia. Assuming that they are sent packing as well, that's going to have an enormous impact, is it not, on U.S. intelligence gathering inside Russia, Steve?
Well, as you might imagine, given the sensitivity of intelligence collection and what happens in Moscow and in Russia, I'm not really much of a liberty to talk about that. But I can say that the removal of 35 diplomats, whether it's Russian diplomats in Washington or whether it is American diplomats in Moscow, will have an effect on the mission of both of those embassies. So yes, there will be a price to pay on both sides.
Jill, help us understand Vladimir Putin's expected reactions here. I'm not going to ask you to predict that. That's an impossible thing to do. Our intelligence agencies have trouble doing that as well. He has said, his spokesman has said, there is no alternative to reciprocal measures. But he also has what he presumes to be, I imagine, a friendlier U.S. president coming in. Does he temper his responses now, knowing that he will have a new man in charge here in a few weeks' time?
I think he's looking at his watch and saying, we've got 3 weeks, so we might as well let it all hang out. I mean, you look at what they're doing. That step with the Anglo-American school is kind of a personal, tawdry step by the Russians to get back at what they perceive are tawdry steps probably by the Americans. But I think Putin will probably look at this very seriously, look at things that he can do in a very strict, let's say, cyber way. He will do things that are symbolic and personal. And then he will do other things that would have to do with intelligence. So I think it will be multi-level, and they keep saying it's going to be tit for tat. So if there are some things that will not be revealed that the Obama administration will be taking, there will be things that will be not revealed by the Russians as well. But Jim, I can tell you, the level of personal comments is amazing. On social media, the comments about Obama coming from the Russian administration are really unbelievable. You know, calling them losers, that this administration isn't really an administration, they're just a bunch of losers. That tweet coming from the Russian embassy in England, in London, the lame duck, an actual picture of a duck. It's pretty personal.
No question. We've heard some of that in our own politics here in the U.S. Juliet, you were on the White House call earlier, gave some more details on this response. You say that the White House made it clear this was a reaction not just to the hacking, though perhaps primarily, but also tied to, as well, Russia's conduct towards U.S. diplomats on the ground in Russia.
Yeah, sort of a less reported story over the last couple months, and Jill has certainly talked about it before, is just the, I would say, antagonism, harassment, sometimes even physical, of U.S. personnel in Russia. So the White House was clear that while, we're all focused on cyber, this actually is bigger than the cyber attack, that these sanctions. And I think they wanted to make it clear for two reasons. One is there's no wiggle room in the intelligence community's assessments today. I just want to make that clear. There's no sort of outlier intelligence agency like we saw with the FBI perhaps earlier. The second is that because the executive order can only be rescinded by a president, it will require Trump, if he chooses to do so, to essentially go against his entire intelligence community. He can certainly do that, but it would take some explanation vis-a-vis his intelligence community, the one that he will be governing in the future. And so it's just important to note that that the executive order is not solely related to Russia. It could apply to the Chinese or the North Koreans if they try to do this again. And it's not solely focused on just cyber hacking. It's against any nation that now or in the future might try to undermine our democratic processes. So while we're focused on 2016, this really is a statement about 2018, 2020, and elections ahead.
Perhaps strategically so, but let's not forget Donald Trump to this point has been willing to stand up against his entire intelligence community. Maybe that doesn't change. Please hold that thought. We'll pick up on this after a quick break and talk more about where this goes when it is only